This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Sarah Lancaster, K-State wheat specialist, kicks off the show by reminding producers about the importance of controlling weeds after wheat harvest. K-State Extension agents Jeff Seiler, David Hallauer, and Allen Baker keep the show rolling by providing a wheat harvest update from their areas. They say how their farmers are feeling and if there were any concerns this year. Ending today's show is K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini as she covers how hot weather, fungal diseases, and hornworms can all cause problems for tomatoes. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show discussing controlling weeds after wheat harvest. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
Sarah, before we talk about the different herbicides used for controlling weeds after wheat harvest, why is this something important?
So really, there's a handful of reasons why we want to control weeds after wheat harvest. So one of the ones that comes first and foremost to my mind is just managing the weed seed bank, right? Because every weed that gets to grow and produce seed is going to, in the case of things like Palmer amaranth and kochia, we're controlling, thousands of plants the next generation. So managing the weed seed bank would be one priority. Managing water resources would be another priority. So just thinking about conserving moisture for whatever that subsequent crop is going to be in your crop rotation. And then another factor would be if folks are double cropping, right? So I sort of think of double cropping in this situation as part weed control and part like agronomics and having a cash crop. But still, you need to make sure that you've controlled any of those weeds that are emerging or coming up so that you can have a successful double crop.
Supporting the importance of starting with a clean field for each crop then?
That's right. You sound like a good scientist, Shelby. Start clean, stay clean.
Sarah, talking about a few of those different herbicides, what is one of the herbicides producers might want to use?
Yeah, so one of the products that commonly gets talked about when we talk about post-harvest weed control in wheat is gramoxone. And I feel like I should say here that post-harvest is the key there because some folks are curious about gramoxone as a harvest aid before harvest. And it is not labeled, so that would be a big no-no to use gramoxone before you've harvested your wheat. But it is one that gets used a lot in wheat stubble. A lot of times, depending on what your rotation is going to be, you would use either atrazine or metribuzin with that. There's some synergy that goes on between the paraquat and then the group 5 herbicides. So atrazine and metribuzin are photosynthesis inhibitors in group 5. And they work to enhance the activity of paraquat. So that is one really common application that we hear folks talking about and see folks putting out in the field after wheat harvest.
And thinking of paraquat, some training is needed if producers are choosing to use that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Shelby. So every 3 years, any handlers of a product that contains paraquat are required to go through a training. And it's an online training. It's not terribly cumbersome to get that box checked for folks.
And you mentioned those group 5 herbicides, atrazine and metribuzin. What are some differences between them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So atrazine, we think about being a corn and sorghum herbicide. Metribuzin, we typically are using ahead of soybeans. So there are some differences in the chemistries. And so, if you think about the chemical molecule, and one of the things that is interesting about that, Shelby, is that we have quite a bit actually of triazine resistance. And our key weeds, our pigweeds and our kochia, mostly post-emergence. One of the things we see is that metribuzin will still control triazine-resistant pigweeds or atrazine-resistant pigweeds. So that's something to keep in mind if you know that about the characteristics of the weeds in a particular field. If you know that atrazine isn't controlling them well, metribuzin may be a good alternative there simply because it will control those resistant weeds.
And wanting to mention, this is an Agronomy eUpdate article. There's a paragraph in there that talks about a double knock strategy. What is that?
So a double knock strategy, Shelby, is basically a planned 2-pass program for post-emergence weed control. So it would look something like coming after wheat harvest with some sort of systemic herbicide that we know is going to do a decent job of weed control. I mean, the last time we talked, Shelby, we talked about all the challenges associated with killing weeds when it's 100 degrees outside, right? So after wheat harvest is particularly challenging because you have drought-stressed weeds and you have weeds that have been half harvested, right? So you've got injured plants already that aren't maybe functioning as well as we need them to. So we're going to apply a systemic herbicide knowing that it's not going to perform at its peak capacity. And then the next step, the second knock, would be to come in with a contact herbicide. So that would be where we come in with something like our paraquat type of application and do that planned 2-pass program, knowing that we'll then knock the leaves off and kind of put the final nail in the coffin, hopefully, for those weeds.
What other herbicides might a grower consider using?
Yeah, so the other 2 products that are mentioned in the article, Shelby, are Sharpen and Valor or flumioxazin, and also we did talk about Reviton in the article as well. So all 3 of those products are group 14 herbicides, so PPO inhibiting herbicides. And so that becomes important to know if you have PPO resistance in particularly your pigweed populations in Kansas. And so we like products like Valor because it does provide some residual activity. And so that can be a really good way to get that residual weed control as well as some burn down activity. Sharpen and Reviton, even though they're in the same herbicide family or herbicide group, those 2 are similar but a little bit different than flumioxazin. I would say they have a little bit more kind of burn down efficacy on some of our broadleaf weeds, but they don't have the residual activity that a flumioxazin containing a product like Valor would have. So they can be good ways to, keep multiple modes of action in and provide some good burn down activity. So one thing about Sharpen and Reviton, Shelby, is they're not going to have very good grass activity. So if you need to have some grass control, some control of emerged grasses, we're going to want to add glyphosate to that tank mixture with Sharpen or Reviton.
You mentioned how sometimes the weeds are smaller or could be tall and have been chopped off with that header at wheat harvest. So is this needing growers to get in the field the day after wheat harvest and take care of this, or maybe wait a little while?
Yeah, that's a great question, Shelby. One of the rules of thumb for weed control is that the weed needs to be actively growing for the herbicides to be, especially translocated herbicides that move through the plant. So that would be our 2,4-Ds, dicambas, glyphosates. And also, if you have a contact herbicide, so that would be things like our paraquats, our Sharpen, those products need to have adequate leaf area to be absorbed. And so generally, you want to wait until there's some regrowth on those weeds so that you can actually more effectively get the herbicide to work.
Sarah, what about for weeds that maybe haven't come out of the ground yet?
That's a great point, Shelby. It's easy to see the weeds that are up, right, that have come through that wheat stand and are now rapidly growing since we've taken the wheat canopy off. But the other thing to think about is a little bit of preventive planning, right, and using those residual herbicides. And so it's important to think about, adding a product like atrazine or metribuzin or even a flumioxazin containing product to that herbicide plan for that wheat stubble.
For people who maybe had a little bit thinner of a wheat stand, do they need to be maybe a little bit more cautious on weeds?
Yeah, my guess, Shelby, would be that guys that had a little bit of a thin wheat stand can see the problem before they pull the combine into the field. And so, they're probably already thinking before the combine ever touches the field what they're going to do and how they're going to handle it. Because certainly when we have challenging conditions for tillering or establishment or anything like that, we certainly do see more problems with weeds in our wheat crop.
And are certain herbicides needing to be used if you're in a certain crop rotation?
Yeah, and so really, thinking about crop rotation intervals can be important. So paraquat is not going to have any rotation restrictions. Atrazine, you're limiting yourself to corn or some sort of sorghum, whether that be grain sorghum or forage sorghum. Metribuzin, you can go to soybeans. There is a little bit of a rotation interval for corn. And then flumioxazin, paying attention to rotations is really important. The rotation limitations for flumioxazin containing herbicides are rate dependent. So being aware of your rate and your soil texture is going to be important there. But if you do use Valor, you've got a 30-day replant, 30 to 60-day replant back to wheat. Soybeans can be planted immediately. And then for corn, sorghum, cotton, or sunflowers, you have to wait until next spring. So just keeping that in mind as you think about using a product like Valor. Residual activity is good for weed control, but can cause issues for crop rotation.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about controlling weeds after wheat harvest.
Thanks for the invitation, Shelby.
That was Kansas State University weed specialist Sarah Lancaster. If you'd like to read more on this topic, you can find her Agronomy eUpdate article by going to eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu and finding the June 20th Agronomy eUpdates and finding the article titled Controlling Weeds After Wheat Harvest. I will also link this article in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Also in the show notes will be a link to the 2024 Chemical Weed Control for Field Crops, Pastures, and Noncropland Guide. You can find it in the show notes, as I mentioned, or by going to bookstore.ksre.edu/pubs/Chem Weed Guide. That is ChemWeedGuide.pdf. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State Research and Extension agents from Sedgwick County, Meadowlark District, and Wichita County as they discuss how wheat harvest has gone or is going in their area. We're now cutting to that short break. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Thursday show with another wheat harvest update. This week, we're joined by extension agents from Sedgwick County, the Meadowlark District, and Wichita County. We start our conversation off with Sedgwick County Extension Agriculture Agent Jeff Seiler. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, you bet.
Jeff, how was wheat harvest in your area?
So wheat harvest actually went really well for us in Sedgwick County. I'm hearing some really good numbers. The sentiment from the farmers has been positive. There for a while, once we got into the spring, there was some doubt in there. We got dry. We got really hot there. We were close to showing some moisture stress. You could see it a little bit on the edges of fields in the high trafficked areas. I think we had a day up in the 90s there in April. And once we saw that, it's kind of like, oh no, where are we going with this? But it cooled off and we ended up catching some timely rains, which led to a very successful harvest here.
And what are some of those numbers with the successful harvest?
Yeah, so the range is probably 45 to 90 bushel per acre, and that's dryland yields. I haven't heard many in the 40s. A lot of the numbers I'm hearing are 60, 70 bushel per acre yields, which I would say we're definitely above average as far as what I've heard and been reported to me for our typical year here in the county.
Were there really any concerns with the wheat harvest?
No, not a whole lot. It actually went pretty well. We got started off. We had 4 strong days of harvest. I think we got started probably around June 6th, maybe. We went through that weekend. We caught a rain delay Saturday night, which led to a lot of guys shutting it down on Sunday. But after that, things got going pretty good and harvest went quickly. It seemed pretty efficient. Now, I think we were probably done June 13th or 14th for the most part, besides maybe some irrigated ground that wasn't quite ready. And then that might have got delayed a little more with another rain. But everything seemed to go pretty well from everyone that I've talked to.
So overall, farmers pretty happy with wheat harvest in your area?
Yeah, I would say so, especially after the last 2 years. It was good to have a harvest like this.
Jeff, a positive outlook for this year's wheat crop, but was that the feeling for the whole growing season as well?
No, not quite. So we started off, we're planting the beginning of October. So the first few days of October, we actually had some wheat that went into some dry ground. Some of those fields may have had some not as even establishment, but there we got going into October. We picked up some rains. The rest of the stuff planted after that seemed to come up pretty well. And then going through the winter, our moisture was above average. So once we started greening up in the spring, there was a lot of optimism. Things looked fantastic. It looked like it was going to be a great year. But unfortunately, after that, the rain shut off for quite a while. We went a long time without catching any moisture. Like I talked about, I think it was an April day that got in the 90s, and we started to see some drought stress on some of those on the edges of the field. So at that point, there was some skepticism, but we were extremely fortunate that around that heading time, which is we need rains at that time. It's crucial. We caught them, and it turned out really well for our yields. I was talking with a farmer down in the southeast part of the county, and he mentioned that he had some good bottom ground, and then another field that, didn't really compare in most years, but the yields between those this year were pretty even, which kind of tells us that we didn't really need the soil water holding capacity this year like the good grounds has. We just got those timely rains that really helped a lot of our fields out.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us how wheat harvest went in Sedgwick County.
Yeah, you bet.
That was Sedgwick County Extension Agriculture Agent Jeff Seiler. We're now going to be joined by Meadowlark Extension District Agent for Crops and Soils, David Hallauer. David, thanks for taking the time to join us today and give us a wheat harvest update.
Thank you for having me.
David, how is wheat harvest going in your area?
Well, we don't have a ton of wheat across our district, and so harvest goes pretty quick in our neighborhood. We're all but wrapped up. I think there's a few guys still finishing up some fields. We got just a little bit of moisture and a couple of different spells over the past week or so that has slowed things down a little bit, but just almost done, and it's gone really well, I think.
Before we continue our conversation, where is the Meadowlark District?
We are in the northeast corner of Kansas, Jackson, Jefferson, and Nemaha counties.
And so what have some of those numbers been that you've been hearing from co-ops and farmers for how wheat has been looking?
Pretty variable, I'd say. We've got a mix of some hard red winter wheat as well as some soft wheats. And so, obviously some differences in yield parameters as far as those are concerned. But, we're going to see a lot of those. I think we're going to come in probably as an average overall in the 60 to 70 bushel range in most cases. So pretty decent wheat crop across the board. Test weights have been a little bit variable as well, depending on maybe when we got some of those rains, how far along that wheat was. And so variable, but I think all in all going to be pretty average on the test weight front. And like I say, in the 60 to 70 bushel range for yields most of the way.
Have you had any concerns during the growing season or even up to harvest now?
We did. We were concerned early on about some head scab. We thought with the moisture that we had during the flowering period that we might see some elevated levels of fusarium head blight and see some issues that way. So far, we have not confirmed any of those. Most producers, as they've been harvesting, been looking for some of that and really haven't seen too many issues as far as head scab has been concerned with issues that way.
Any concern for moisture for this week?
We have gotten a little moisture. We never turn that down. We're in the corn and soybean growing region of the state, so we're not going to turn that down this time of the year. But yes, some concern that we're maybe losing a little bit of test weight from the standpoint of delaying this harvest a little bit. But we're hoping that, get back in later this week over the weekend and kind of wrap things up.
What has the sentiment or the feelings of your producers been?
I think that most are pretty happy with what they've seen. Again, we're not a huge wheat growing area, and so this is in a lot of cases, a rotation crop in our part of the country. And I think that anytime that we can get 60, 70, sometimes 80 and 90 bushel wheat crop like we've had in places this year, we're pretty happy with that. We also were, again, concerned about disease, and we didn't have very much fusarium head blight to worry about. We had sporadic stripe rust here and there, but again, nothing so bad that, it really hurt the crop all that much. So pretty happy overall.
Sounds like some good news from the Meadowlark District. David, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Once again, that was Meadowlark Extension District Agent for Crops and Soils, David Hallauer. We're now going to be joined by the Wichita County Extension Agent, Allen Baker, for a wheat harvest update in Wichita County. Allen, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
You bet, Shelby.
Allen, how is wheat harvest going in Wichita County?
Well, Shelby, we are having an excellent wheat harvest this year in Wichita County. Numbers, bushels coming in are tremendous.
And what are some of those numbers with harvest?
I've heard, talking to farmers and elevators, we are ranging on the low end of dry land, 30 bushel to the acre, all the way up to the top end, 95 bushels an acre on dry land. Not heard a lot of irrigated yet. One field I heard was 78 bushel the acre, and that was behind corn. So if that's any indication of how good our wheat is, some of them irrigated numbers should be tremendous.
Have you had any concerns with this wheat harvest or wheat growing season?
The only concern we had was early on before we got the rains. The wheat was looking pretty sick there back in May, and it was dry. We had some late breezes that kind of stung that wheat, and a lot of guys kind of just gave up on it. We got the rains, and it just like overnight turned around. That stuff took off, growing, getting thick, putting big heads on. We didn't have a lot of disease pressure this year, so not a lot of guys sprayed for rust, and the wheat just turned out like gangbusters. Some of the best wheat we've probably ever grown in this county.
So pretty happy farmers then?
I would say so. I called a couple this morning and talking to them uptown in the mornings or at the post office. They are very ecstatic for what they're seeing.
What are you seeing for moving forward in wheat harvest in Wichita County?
Well, I would say we should be all but done by July 4th. So that's great. I mean, last year we was county fair and guys were still cutting wheat. It was so late. So to get done that early, I mean, some guys may double crop back some corn or milo after some of their wheat. So that'll get them a good head start on that. And I mean, I think conditions are good for doing some of that stuff or just spraying it, fallowing it till next year. So everything's kind of falling into place.
Allen, thanks for taking the time to join us today and give us a positive update on the wheat harvest for Wichita County.
You bet.
That was Wichita County Extension Agent Allen Baker, and he was joined by Meadowlark Extension District Agent for Crops and Soils David Hallauer and Sedgwick County Extension Agriculture Agent Jeff Seiler as they all provided wheat harvest updates for their areas. A great way to stay up to date with the wheat harvest in Kansas is, of course, following along with Kansas Wheat. You can check them out by going to kswheat.com. Again, that is kswheat.com, which I will link in today's show notes on acttoday.net. You can also follow along with Kansas Wheat by checking them out on social media, on Instagram, Twitter or X, Facebook, or YouTube. You can also stay up to date with things happening with crop production right now by following along with the K-State Agronomy eUpdates. And as always, you can sign up for those by going to eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Once again, that is eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we'll have more for you ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. If you're growing tomatoes, you know there are several things that can cause tomato trouble. K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini covers how hot weather, fungal diseases, and hornworms can all cause problems. Cynthia, no doubt a lot of questions coming in about tomatoes because it is the most popular crop in the garden, and a lot of questions, especially this time of year, because we start to see the temperatures go up, and that can have an impact.
Absolutely. So with the higher temperatures we've been seeing lately, you may be seeing some leaf curling. You might be seeing the blossoms dropping, and that is very normal. One of the problems with that is as the blossoms are dropping, it's going to reduce the amount of pollination that we're getting because there's not flowers there. So it could temporarily reduce the amount of fruit produced. It is a problem, though, that will resolve itself as the temperatures return to normal. When the daytime temperature is above 85, 90 and the nighttime temperature is staying elevated as well, that's typically when we see those kinds of problems.
Disease-wise, we might start seeing some leaf spot?
Yeah, we've been seeing, hearing some reports of different types of spotting that people are seeing on their tomato plants. There's septoria leaf spot as well as early blight. Septoria leaf spot is more common in Kansas, but both of these they have similar symptoms. So the symptoms typically start with spotting at the lower leaves, and that's a result of the spores splashing up from the soil or debris that has been left over winter. And then it'll, over time, travel up the plant. So unfortunately, if you've had a problem with these in the past, you're going to have a problem with them again. And so that's why proper care for your tomato plants is so important. You could use a preventative, but unfortunately, we're kind of past that point right now in the year. So that's something to keep in mind for next year, along with other proper tomato care.
So really all you could do at this point, if you have the lower leaves, you could kind of pick those lower leaves off?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead and remove those lower leaves. It's not too late to make sure you're watering properly. Drip irrigation is always a recommendation. If you need to use a hose and do overhead watering, get that hose down at the base of the plant so it's not splashing and getting the leaves wet. Watering in the morning is better than in the evening because the leaves will dry out quicker and be less likely to spread the disease as quickly. Mulching around your tomato plants is also a recommendation for proper practices. Another one that's really beneficial, if possible, is to practice crop rotation. Let's say that this year you're experiencing septoria leaf spot. When the season is over, clean out the garden, get those leaves, the tomato plants out of there, destroy the tomato plants. Do not compost them because more than likely your compost heap is not going to get hot enough to kill off that disease. You can trash them, you can burn them if you're in an area that's allowed. And then next year, don't plant your tomatoes in the same spot. Find another location where you can plant your tomatoes. And that's going to really give you the best shot of not contracting the disease again next year.
Tomato hornworms, are we seeing that?
You can be sure if you've got tomatoes, you're going to see some hornworms. And hopefully you can get to the point where you find that a little bit exciting. They're really cool looking caterpillars. And if you have kids, get them involved in the hunt for the caterpillars because if your leaves are getting eaten, and kind of down to those, you're just seeing big old chunks of leaves being bitten out, you probably have hornworms. If you're seeing black droppings on the leaves, that's another indicator that you've got hornworms. So take some time, get down and look closely at the leaves. They do camouflage themselves well against the backdrop of those plants. But once you find them, you can remove them by hand. And even if you can't find them, if you're not spraying pesticides or herbicides, you may be able to attract parasitic wasps, which will take care of the hornworms on their own. And that's a really intriguing process to watch. So there's all kinds of fun things that you can enjoy, even with a pest like the tomato hornworm.
Are there some care recommendations that you have?
Absolutely. So along with the ones that I already mentioned,
that's Cynthia Domenghini, a K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist with information on growing tomatoes. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.